Good day, everyone. It's certainly my pleasure to be with you today. I wish we were together in person. However, hopefully soon we'll be able to gather again. My name is Rosalind Leeck. I'm the Regional Director for Northeast Asia, which is Japan and Korea. I've been in that role for about a year and a half. And it's been really nice to be able to come back to the Japan and Korea market. I started my career as a trader, trading food-grade soybeans to both Japan and Korea. So it's been very nice to reconnect with some old acquaintances and to meet new acquaintances. So, like I said, it's been a true pleasure to come back to Japan and Korea. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the region in general, and then we'll go into profiles of Japan and Korea from a soybean market standpoint. And we'll conclude today talking about sustainability. Over the past few years, we've seen a tremendous growth and interest for sustainability and sustainable sourcing. And so we want to talk a little bit about what that means and what that looks like for Japan and Korea. So for Japan and Korea, the bottom line is that those markets are import dependent. They're mature markets in the fact that the aging populations, more so in Japan than in Korea, but in any case, certainly populations that are aging. They have very well-established industries. So in both the livestock, crush, and process and feed manufacturing sectors, all are very well-established and long-term industries. So that results in marginal growth opportunities. We'll talk more in detail on all of these topics as we go through the countries, but just important to say that while they are mature markets, they're still incredibly important markets for U.S. soy industry. And we continue to make sure that we are there to partner with the local stakeholders and deliver the products and the services that are needed by the end. So when we talk about Japan, I like to show this slide because Japan, the Japan office, our office in Tokyo, was the very first office that U.S. soy industry opened overseas back in 1956. So we've been operating in Japan market for 60 years, over 60 years. And during that time, we have developed very strong relationships with the industry to the point that no longer is it just a relationship from an industry to industry standpoint, but they've become true partnerships. We work together to solve the collective issues of the industry, whether that be something that the importers are facing or something that the exporters are facing, so that we ensure that we're still able to continue to supply the market. So again, that 60 plus years of camaraderie and partnership continues to play an important role today. So let's start with Japan soy consumption. Japan relies very heavily on soy foods and on other soy products. And so it's within the culture that there's a strong demand for soy foods and soy products. And we can see that when we start looking at what's domestically produced versus what's imported. So the total soybean consumption in Japan is 3.5 million tons. Of that, about 3.3 million tons is imported, and then another 200,000 tons plus is produced domestically. So again, going back to the very first point, this market is very reliant on imports. So the 2019 soybean imports, again, 3.3 million tons, 2.5 million tons of that went to the crush sector, and about 700,000 tons of that went to the food sector, and then another small amount that went into other. So that could be seed or other soy products that weren't necessarily identified as either food or crushing. So for the crushing sector, the U.S. has a very strong market share of about 84%. And for the food sector, we also have a strong market of about 50%. We'll talk a little bit more about who else is playing in this market, but that's a bit of an overview for you. So here's the total soybean market share. As you can see, when you look at the entire complex for both food and crush beans, the U.S. has a 74% market share, whereas Brazil has 15%, Canada 10%, and then China 1%. So U.S. has been the largest supplier of soybeans to Japan for many years, and we have continued to average over 70% market share for many decades as well. And so we, again, as I mentioned earlier, Japan is a very important market to us, and we want to ensure that we continue to strive to deliver the products that are needed by the marketplace. So we've been talking about the soybean meal or the soybean market. Now let's talk a little bit about the soybean meal market. So as you can see, over the last number of years, the market has been relatively stable. We've seen a small decline there in the middle years where it was largely due to price. The price of soybean meal had really become quite costly, and the crush margins between rapeseed and soybean had also started to deteriorate. So when you look here in the last 5 years, things have been very stable. And you can see that we've seen the crush industry come back to where there's actually more domestically produced soybean meal than there is imported. However, it's still relatively close to a 50-50 split. So as we look to the next few slides, we'll talk a little bit more about market share and the roles that play. Here we've got a depiction of the market share. So you can see that certainly over the past couple of years, the Chinese soybean meal imports decreased and the US and Brazilian soybean meal imports increased. You know, the US is an interesting soybean export market because we have relatively limited supply available for export. But we're clearly the preferred supplier for the Japanese market when it comes to looking at the overall complex. So if you consider that the US has 84% share for the imported crush beans, and then we also have about a 20% market share for the imported meal, overall we have a pretty strong market share for total soybean meal consumption and production in Japan. You know, there are a number of reasons that Japanese crushers like the US soybeans, you know, not just does it produce a reliable quality meal, but there's also a lot of advantages for the refining and production of oil. So here you can see the Japanese livestock industry for the last 13 years. So the livestock sector has continued to consolidate and modernize. And we've seen the number of farms decrease while the animal production has remained mostly stable. And so it's anticipated that that would continue. And on this next slide, you can see that the feed production has also remained very stable at, you know, just under 25 million tons for, you know, many years. While we don't anticipate tremendous change in this, it's good to know where the stability is and so that we can continue to work with the industry to deliver the products that are needed. When you look at the soybean meal use, that soybean meal that's included in the compound feed, 80% of the soybean meal that is consumed in Japan is consumed by poultry and swine. And that's pretty typical based on feed rations. But I think that it's very interesting to see this chart and how strong the poultry industry is in Japan, as well as the swine sector. So a couple conclusions for the Japan market. As you've heard me say several times, it's very stable. There are some small opportunities to increase market share and a little bit to increase demand. Primarily, those opportunities really exist either in the soybean meal market from an export of soybean meal from the US to Japan, or in the food bean market. As you saw, we have 50% market share there, and we think that there's some opportunity to gain back a higher market share. And particularly as we've seen the aging population return to demanding more soy foods, particularly natto. And so the US has over 70% market share in natto, and it's a growing market. And then the final point is that Japan remains an incredibly important market for the US soy industry. We have a very high market share there, but we also have that important relationship and the important collaboration with Japan in order to address all of the issues the industry may face. Japan tends to be a leader on establishing sound regulatory policy, and so we like to continue to work to ensure that the US soy industry is able to supply the market what the Japanese crushing and consumers demand. So now let's go ahead and visit Korea. We'll go through very similar slides for the Korean market, but there are some nuances and some differences certainly. So for Korea, Total soybean imports are 1.3 million tons, so a much smaller market than Japan. The crush sector imports about 980,000 tons, whereas the food industry imports just under 250,000 tons. And in the other category, in Korea, one of the large portions of that is the sprouting bean. And so you can see the US share of the sprouting bean is about 12%. We think we have some opportunity to increase that. But on the crush side, much like Japan, we have an 88% market share for the crush beans going into Korea and 85% on the food beans. There are a number of reasons for that, which we'll talk a bit more about, but as we move into the soybean meal discussion, it starts to look quite different from what we've already seen and talked about. So to look at the soybean meal industry or the soybean industry in Korea, as you can see, here's the historical production and import. So production has been very stable, ranging between 700 and 750,000 tons. Imports have also been relatively stable. So again, we see an industry, a feed sector that is incredibly stable, but also has some very high value and opportunity. In 2019, the soybean meal use in the feed industry, there was 1.9 million tons that was imported soybean meal, so quite a different picture from what we saw in Japan, where it was nearly 50-50. And the domestic soybean meal production is 714,000 tons. So of that 2.6 million tons that's used in the feed sector, the U.S. share in total is considerably less, given that we have a relatively small market share of just 3% for imported soybean meal. And we will talk more about why that's the case. So the compound feed manufacturing and production in Korea is 20.5 million metric tons. Again, you can see that poultry and swine dominate that, accounting for not quite half, but a large portion of the actual compound feed manufacturing. And then you have beef and dairy, and then other sectors as well. So we saw the historical information on soybean meal production and import, and not surprising, you would see that the compound feed production has also followed those same trends. So there has been a little bit of growth, but it is a relatively stable market in that there's not a tremendous growth opportunity. However, it's a place to where we know what to expect. And while there was ASF in Korea in late 2019, it certainly seems that that has been gotten under control, and the feed sector, while it did have a little bit of a downtick for a while, it is going to have a very small impact overall on what's happening in the feed sector. So let's talk a little bit about the Korean feed industry. So there really are two primary players in the Korean feed sector. One is the Korean Feed Association, which has 43 member mills. When they're making their purchasing decisions in their three buying groups, they do consider both price and quality. And then we have NH Feed, which is 12 feed mills, and they play a key role for the government's feed market, and they are more sensitive to price than KFA. So while the structure of the market is quite different than we see in many places around the world. So when you end up having these multiple feed mills coming together to try and import product, it does change the decision-making process. So while the superior nutritional aspects of U.S. soybean meal are considered, oftentimes price becomes the determining factor. And as we all know, the U.S. tends not to be incredibly price competitive on soybean meal all the time. So that is a challenge for us in the Korean market. When we look at how these two organizations, what their role is in the market, so KFA has about 69% market share of the entire production, and NH Feed has 31%, and then there are a few other smaller players that have a very small portion of the market. So some quick conclusions on Korea. Again, it's a very stable market. there are small opportunities to increase market share and demand. The food bean market in Korea is more subject to price and availability due to the tender system and TRQs. In Japan, the system is very much that everything is contract grown from the beginning, so there's very little in the spot market, whereas in Korea, there tends to be a little bit more of the spot business that's conducted. The Korea-US Free Trade Agreement doesn't have a major impact on the feed sector or on whole bean imports for crushing. However, it is important for oil and food beans. So in the oil market for soybean oil exports, we have over 95% market share. And then in the food bean market, the US has a higher TRQ than many other of the trading partners. However, that's still only a small portion of the total imports that are that go into Korea. So, and again, it's an important market for the US. We've worked very closely with many of the Korean industry in order to bring new products to the market, in order to continue to have a positive influence on some of the regulatory environment that we face around the world. So we once again find that Korea to be an incredibly important partner for the U.S. soy industry, and we look forward to continuing to strive to provide solutions for the industries. So finally, we'll talk a little bit about sustainability, and my colleague Adi Rennie has also given a presentation, so I will keep this very directed at the region itself. We've seen over the last few years increased interest in sustainability. So we have a program called the Soy Sustainability Assurance Protocol that allows exporters to provide verification in the form of a certificate to accompany shipments that are leaving the U.S., verifying that those soybeans or soybean meal or whatever soy product has been produced in a sustainable manner. So we have benchmarked the SSAP against a number of soy sourcing standards. One of the first was the European Feed Manufacturers Association soy sourcing guidelines. And then one of the most significant impacts, particularly for Japan, but it also has had some other impact within Asia in general, is that when Tokyo Olympic Planning Committee started to look at their Olympics, they wanted to have the most sustainable Olympics ever. And so they established some sustainable sourcing guidelines. And in 2018, SSAP was approved by the Tokyo Olympic Planning Committee and Procurement Committee as meeting their guidelines. And so products that are going to go to Japan in order to supply the Olympics, which now is going to be in July of 2021, U.S. soy does qualify for that. So that was an important milestone that really elevated the sustainability discussion in Japan. Prior to that time, there hadn't been a whole lot of demand for sustainability. Whereas in Korea, we had seen already a significant increase in interest for sustainability, and particularly the certification of sustainability for some of the companies to use in their corporate social responsibility reports and in outreach with their investors and stakeholders. But back to Japan, the recognition by the Tokyo Olympic Procurement Committee really did elevate that standing in Japan. And so here was our official approval letter from the Olympic Organizing Committee. Once again, we think that that was a pretty substantial achievement. So our team did a great job in Japan of getting that recognition. When we look at total shipments to all regions, you can see that North Asia accounts for about 13% of all the sustainability certificates that are requested. And when you consider the size of North Asia in comparison to some of the other markets and some of the other countries, it certainly is pretty impressive when you see that nearly 85% of the shipments that go to North Asia, to Japan and Korea, do so with a verification of sustainability. The only other region that even comes close is EU, and certainly there are some compliance requirements in the EU that drive that more so than any other part of the world. But with that, I will conclude. Thank you again so much for joining us today and for listening to us. would welcome any opportunities to engage on any questions that you may have about Japan and Korea. Thank you.